All right, guys. Welcome to my lecture on macronutrients. Um, in today, we're going to go over kind of guidelines on what macronutrients you want to use, depending on if you're a more endurance-based athlete or a strength athlete or maybe a physique athlete. And then I'll cover, general population, right? So what if you're none of those, and you want to know what your macro should be, right? We have a couple different macros, and we'll go through each of those, what they do, and why they're important. So, to remind you, if you haven't seen any of my lectures or following my content about me, I am Brandon Roberts. I did a basically bachelor's in microbiology, master's in exercise science, and then I combined the two and did a muscle biology PhD. Since then, I've done a postdoc, and I'm basically a lecturer at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, where I teach sports nutrition and a lot of different kinesiology classes. You can find my stuff around the web, right? So I make a lot of content for a lot of different people. As you can see, Tailored Coaching Method is one of those. Examine, Revive Stronger, Strength Guys, JPS Health and Education, Stronger by Science. I kind of have a dual nature in that I've been an online coach since 2015, so not terribly long, but long enough to have a couple hundred clients and get the gist of everything and practice is what I'd call it. And then I've been an in-person coach since 2012, and I've been a scientist, right, all through my academic career. So I kind of meld those two together and apply my experience with physique athletes as a physique athlete, as you can see here, to help people out, right? So I want to help you, and I'm going to give you some guidelines to do that today. So we're going to talk again about protein, carbs, fat, and then the sneaky one, alcohol, which we all, love, but doesn't necessarily fit into any macronutrient directly. You're not going to find it on a nutrition label when you look on the back. So let's start very basic. You probably know this. 1 gram of protein is 4 calories. 1 gram of carbohydrate is also 4 calories. Now, 1 gram of fat is 9 calories. So you can see where if you start escalating those grams of fat, you could get your calories up pretty dang quickly. And so that's why we have to be a little careful when we measure, how we measure, and what methods we're using to track calories, and if we're doing it at all, right? Now, when we look at percentages, a lot of people like to look at percentages for calories, what percentage of protein, what percentage of carbs, what percentage of fat. We have the acceptable macronutrient distribution ranges. So those are the kind of USA ranges right there on the left. 10 to 35% protein, 45 to 65% carbs, and 20 to 35% fats. Now, when you compare these ranges, which are fairly broad, you're probably eating within those ranges right now without any changes. When you compare those to the average USA intake, which if you're listening to this and you're following our content and you're using LogSmarter, you're probably much better than the average US individual. They consume about 18% protein, 47% carbs, and 35% fats by calories, right? So those gram numbers are going to be a little bit different, when you're looking at carbs and fats. So keep that in mind. But those are just some basic facts that you need to know going into this. So where should my ranges be, and what's kind of normal? Now next we're going to jump right into protein. Protein is my favorite macronutrient. And again, going back to the basics, because if you can't or you don't understand the fundamentals of protein intake, it's really hard to understand why we need so much protein, or why we need a moderate amount for some people. So the EAR is the average requirement for 50% of the population to basically just survive. And that's 0.66 grams per kilogram of body weight. So you'll see these numbers in grams per kilogram. You find those in the science a lot more. I know in the US we use different systems, but just think of everything in grams per kilogram per now. And then the RDA, which you're probably familiar with, is 0.8 grams per kilogram per day of body weight. Now, the question is that enough, right? do we need to eat more? Do we need to eat less? Probably not less. Actually, if you go under the RDA is basically to maintain your muscle mass. So if you eat under the RDA, or if you have a disease, you can actually start to lose muscle mass, and that's not something that we want to do pretty much ever. So staying in line with some basics, there's in 2008 or 16 rather, there was a study that found an inverse association between protein intake and body weight and BMI. And it was just a correlation. So the more protein you ate, the less body weight and BMI you had. Generally a good thing. Now, correlation isn't causation. We know that. And I see a lot of people complain about BMI, which is very fair. If you're fit, if you have a lot of muscle on you, if you've been training for a long time, or maybe you're an athlete, BMI is probably not the best method for you to use. However, when we look at the general population, and I'll throw you some stats here in a second, most people are overweight. A lot of people are obese, and they mostly don't eat enough protein. So I'll say that. They eat a lot of everything. They overeat. Essentially, that's how you get overweight and obese. But they're lacking in their protein department. So let's look at a couple of things that have changed in the past few years. And that is high protein everything, right? If you've been, well, of course you've been around, but if you've been following products and you go to the grocery store, you will see high protein bread, milk, cereal, chips, cookies, like you name it, it's there and it's high protein. And that's a good thing in some cases. I think it goes beyond what's needed in some cases too. But nonetheless, it's pretty easy to get your protein nowadays. So how much protein do people eat? If the RDA is 0.8 and the average intake is about 1.0 grams per kilogram. And it's been that way for a long time. You look at the data from the CDC, NIH, people eat about 1 gram. In the southeast, where I'm from, they eat about 1.1, 1.15 grams per kilogram, which is not bad at all. They have other habits that are counterintuitive or counterproductive to those high protein intakes. But, people aren't terribly off. So a few minor changes can go a long way. And those stats I was talking about. So protein and obesity. Not necessarily related, but the percentage of adults who are obese is climbing, and it is very much mirrored by the percentage of people who are overweight. So if we can make a change by increasing the protein in your diet, because as I'll show you in a second, it's very satiating, and it's not easily at all stored as fat. It is the least macronutrient friendly fat storage of the three. So if you're eating low protein or just like moderate protein, you could just increase your protein and solve a good number of problems. So let's take a look, a little bit more data. And what I like to do is I read a lot of literature. I summarize a lot of literature. I make a lot of content. But there are large organizations who are very much smarter than I am. And when you look at their recommendations, they are a bunch of scientists looking at the same data I am and coming to somewhat of the same conclusions. So if we look at endurance athletes, or maybe you're not an endurance athlete, but cardio is your main form of exercise. We'll put it that way. You can see your protein intake should be probably 1.2 to 2 grams per kilogram per day, which is not terrible. And I put some reference ranges at the bottom so you can see pounds to kilograms. So 100 pounds is 45.4, 200 pounds is 90.7 about. There's some rounding in there. But you kind of get an idea of where you should be or where your body weight should be. And then you can multiply within that range to see how much protein you need per day. Now, for resistance training people or strength athletes, I think there was a really good meta-analysis from 2018 showing that the break point as a meta-regression, that's that line in the middle kind of going upwards, is right around 1.6 grams per kilogram per day. The upper confidence interval was 2.2 grams per kilogram. So if we want to be super confident, we would lean more towards the 95% confidence interval, which is what I generally do. It's about 2.2 grams per kilogram per day. So if you strength train or resistance train, basically same thing, you probably need more protein because you're building muscle, right? You're repairing muscle. You have a lot more metabolic activities going on. And that brings me to kind of the people who probably eat the most protein, which are those physique athletes, bodybuilders, physique competitors, bikini, all of those different types of classes, divisions, pretty much across the board. You'll see that those people eat a ton of protein. So you're looking at upwards above 1.8. Most of them eat at least 2.2. So we published a review on physique athletes and recommended 1.8 to 2.7 kind of as a standard practice. And then if you're dieting or in prep, you can go all the way up to 3.5. Now, there are a number of studies that have people intaking 3 to 4 grams per kilogram per day. That's quite excessive, but they do have some good preliminary results. So, maybe in the next 5-10 years, we'll know that more is better, or there's kind of that limit. So the science is ever evolving. But right now, those are the different types of athletes, and that's how I like to break it down. So whatever you're closest to is what I would suggest you pick for your protein. So what does protein do? A little bit of science for you. So increased muscle protein synthesis, that's how we build muscle. It is arguably the most satiating on a relative level macronutrient. It is involved in immunity, so your responses to things outside the body. You have an immune response. Protein is kind of the backbone of a lot of those structures. It is also the backbone for a lot of the structures and hormones and enzymes, so it's pretty much used all the time. You break protein down into amino acids, and those are recycled into all the different functions in your body. But to put it very kind of simply, protein helps you grow and repair most of the cells in your body. Okay, so circling back, how much protein should you eat? Well, it depends, and I'm not going to give you a finite answer, but ranges from 1.2 to 3.5 grams per kilogram per day. I don't like to use protein in percentages like we saw at the beginning, because I don't think that's a very good way to go about it when a lot of these studies are based on relative levels of protein intake and not percentages. So I would recommend, when you're figuring out your macros, do your protein first, figure out what you want to eat, and then kind of take the rest of the calories that you have for the day and split those between fat and carbs as you see fit. Like, we'll go over those next. So carbs, right? Gen Pop, 45 to 65%. That's a fair solid number. If you are an endurance athlete or a strength and physique athlete, it varies a little bit. So endurance athletes need more carbohydrates, or should I say, they generally perform better on higher carbohydrates because of the activity. Strength athletes are not as high, but still need carbs to perform. Now, if you're general population, totally fine. You have a big range. You can sit in that 45 to 65%. I put an example on here, 2,200 calories. It's pretty standard intake for a male, 160 to 180 pound male for maintenance calories. You can range from 250 to 350 carbs per day, right? Depending on what percentage you want to be at. And this one, I don't generally do until I've done my fat. So I'll find my protein first, my fat intake that I want to have based on my preferences, and then allot the rest of them to carbohydrates. And it'll usually fall within this range. Endurance athletes may need to be a little more kind of conservative, or when they're playing with their macronutrient profile, kind of shade toward those carbs. But in general, this is the last macronutrient, and this is the leftover bucket, is what we like to call it. So what do carbs do? Obviously, diabetes is a big problem in America. They regulate blood glucose. They restore glycogen. So once you go on that run or that hike, whatever you like to do. Glycogen's down a little bit, top it off in the liver and the muscle. So basically, it's a source of energy. And then lastly, people often forget fiber is a carbohydrate, which is very important for digestive health. Off the top of my head, I would say for every 1,000 calories, you should eat about 10 grams of fiber. So that puts most people between 20 and 30 grams per day. Seems to work well. So that's kind of a ballpark for you on fiber. Okay, lastly, fats. 20 to 35%, very broad. You can see 2,200 calories, 20% would be 49 grams, 35% would be 86 grams. That's monstrously different, right? Like those are two different methods of eating. So there was, skip to the next slide. There was a lot of controversy, and there still is a little bit, on what the fat threshold is. So in the 80s, low-fat diets were popular. At some other point, low-carb diets were popular. They kind of been going back and forth, but I will say you need about 20%, or the recommendation from all of the organizations is 20% of your calories from fat to make sure you have plenty of fatty acids so that you can have those fat-soluble vitamins and you can prevent any lipid problems, any super low lipid problems. However, there's no like tolerable upper level intake, and that goes for most of these macronutrients. So it's not like you can eat a lot of fat and then it becomes toxic, other than you'll gain weight. Okay, so what does fat do? We have hormones. Fat plays a very large role in hormone regulation, especially if you get really lean or you lose a lot of weight quickly. Lipid membranes, so if you remember bio from high school or whatever, fat basically makes up a lot of membranes. Energy, of course, sitting here, I am burning mostly fat, kind of that switch between carbohydrate and oxidation and fat oxidation, mostly fat right now I'm sitting. Vitamin solubility, talked about that, and then of course taste, right? Fat tastes really good, so it's a palate type thing. Okay, now getting away from macronutrients a little bit, we have all of these different types of diets. So people come to me and they're like, "What diet should I use?" And I'm like, "Well, it depends. You have everything from carnivore to vegetarian to Atkins, low fat, low carb, paleo, ketogenic, right? All of these different diets, they can all work. Some of them work a little better than others, but ultimately, if you're in a caloric deficit, you're going to lose weight over time. It may take some time. You may not lose weight in a linear manner, but if you're eating low enough, you will lose weight, or preferably resistance train, and you'll lose fat. So some examples of these extremes. I just pulled some images off the internet. So the ketogenic diet, we actually wrote a review on ketogenic diet in bodybuilders, and then SciFit, there's a lot of content I've created there about the ketogenic diet if you want to learn more about that. But high fat, low to moderate protein, a traditional ketogenic diet is like, I think it's 80% fat, 15% protein, and 5% carbs, with a threshold around 50 grams of carbs to be ketogenic. Some people can get away with more, some less. But there are issues with this, right? You can't have a very diverse diet. So vegetables, a lot of vegetables, and fruits are kind of out. You have to be very careful with your carb intake. Don't want to get out of ketogenesis, because then you have to get back into it, and that part sucks. On the other hand, you have the vegetarian diet, right? They struggle with protein intake a lot of the time. They also sometimes struggle with certain vitamins. You have to supplement things to get enough vitamins. So you have to be careful with that extreme of a diet. Although it is more healthy, I would say, in the grand scheme of things, than most diets. And then you have the really extreme, like the carnivore diet, which is just a straight meat diet. And so, I would honestly probably stay away from that one. The other two you could probably get by with for a little bit, but what I like to do is take the more moderate approach. And these are everything. All these are called diets, but you don't have to be in a deficit or trying to lose weight to be on one of these diets. So you have Mediterranean, the Dash, and the Mayo Clinic, and these are all based around vegetables. At the bottom of your pyramids, you have vegetables and fruits, right? Maybe grains. You have low-fat dairy. Proteins, third on all of these, and then sweets and desserts are at the top, a very minimal amount you want to keep in there. So this is kind of what I try to get people to do rather than try something extreme. It's like, let's instill some good habits. Let's eat some fruit, eat plenty of vegetables, be careful with our carbs and our fats, and eat our protein. And that generally does the trick. It's not as fantastical as some of these crash diets. With a ketogenic diet and the carnivore diet, you would see glycogen losses very rapidly, and so you'd see a big drop in weight, which could be rewarding or motivating. And some of these diets, you're not going to see that. It's just going to be gradual. The other thing I wanted to touch on is whole versus processed food. Now, in this day and age, we move quickly. We don't have much time. We want things easy and cheap and, bam, grab it on the way to the next thing, right? So we have these ultra-processed foods, your burgers, your fast food, your prepackaged food. And then we have kind of on the other side an unprocessed diet. So think mom or dad's home cooking, made from scratch, maybe grandparents cooking. And how those different things are made, maybe even on the unprocessed side, having more just more vegetables in general, or more things that are fresh and local. Okay, but I want to point out this study. So I believe it was Hall et al. 2019, maybe 20, probably 19. But they compared a ultra-processed diet to an unprocessed diet, and they just let people eat ad libitum, so as much as you want, for 14 days. And you can see that the ultra-processed diet ate about 1,000 more calories per day, and their body weight increased, while the unprocessed diet's body weight decreased a little bit. I mean, it was like a kilo, which is nothing major, but they ate lower calories. Now, if you took this out, it might be different, but a lot of data is starting to indicate that ultra-processed diets are not the best, and you don't want to live off of them. You can use them in moderation, but you do want to use fresh fruits and vegetables and kind of cook more than getting processed stuff. And there's a lot of different ways you can do that now, so you have to just be a little creative sometimes. Okay, so ultra-processed products, they're energy dense. Think of like a donut is honestly what I like to think of, or a Twinkie, or prepackaged, very quick, high carb, high fat things that we find pretty quick and easy in the grocery store. And there is some data indicating these are associated with increased risk of obesity because it's so easy to eat, high calories, and metabolic diseases like, again, diabetes. Now, alcohol, as I mentioned at the top, is kind of its own little thing. So it's not stored. So when you drink alcohol, it's used immediately for energy. And what that means is anything you ingest is going to be stored. Protein, kind of magical. It doesn't get stored as easily. But think fats and carbs. Think of eating, your typical pretzels or your peanuts with your alcohol or whatever you like to have. And so that's not good. And it's essentially been called an empty macronutrient because of this. It also interferes with vitamin absorption. It can make recovering more difficult. Some people have joint issues because of it, and basically just interferes with the body's growth, maintenance, and repair. But again, moderation. I like alcohol and I'm not going to give it up. So, you just have to be careful and time it appropriately and don't overdo it, essentially. And do account for it in your calories for the day, um, so that you can keep track of it and you're not overeating because of alcohol intake. All right, so how do I choose my ideal macronutrients? I'm going to leave that up to you. On the next slide, I have my contact information. So if you want to kind of run your macros by me, you can shoot me an email, give me as much detail as you can, and then maybe we could talk through it. So you have a ballpark for protein, do that first, number one. Then go ahead and do your fats, and lastly, do your carbs. Now, if you track for a while and you realize that you're a more fat-oriented person, maybe you slide those fats up in percentage and those carbs down, or vice versa, right? So play with it. Don't be afraid to change your macronutrients, because ultimately, once you hit your protein, calories are going to be the main factor in whether you lose or gain weight. So with that, here's my contact information. Feel free to reach out, and thank you for listening.